Hello, my loves, and welcome back to an old favourite that we haven't visited for a while, and for that I do apologise. Welcome back to the Ages of Chaos. Now, the last time I did this, I was a little remiss, actually. I was a little remiss in the sense that I missed something out, something very important from the latter days of 7th Ed 40k, and that was the Khorne Daemonkin book. Now, the Khorne Daemonkin book, the reason I'm revisiting it now is that the term Daemonkin has some very special resonance now because it's being resurrected for the new Black Legion stuff in the Vigilus series. The term Daemonkin has been thrown around quite a lot lately, and it looks like it's going to become a much more specific key term or something to that effect, something that affects the nature of Chaos Space Marines and army-wide mechanics, what with the Master of Possession and whatnot. So I thought it'd be a fun time to revisit that particular book. It was really interesting when it first hit because Chaos was in its nadir at that point. We were still struggling with that crappy 6th Ed Chaos Space Marine Codex. There were a couple of additions that had made it a little bit more palatable, but not much. It was really suffering. We'd already had both a 6th and 7th Ed Space Marine Codex that was better, way better. And the Eldar, as they were back then, the Eldari as they were to become, had also had their own 2 codexes in that time, both of which were better. Most of the other armies had also had codices that were better than the Chaos Space Marines. However, what we did have, to coincide with the release of the Bloodthirster, the new plastic Bloodthirster kit that could be turned into 3 different types of Bloodthirster, they decided to reinvigorate Khorne in 40k, and it was something of a shock, I have to tell you. People were of the opinion at that time that Games Workshop had kind of just forgotten about Chaos in 40k and in most game systems, to be honest. They just, because it was in such a bad place, there hadn't been any significant model releases for a very long time. There hadn't been anything special for Chaos for a very long time. As I say, our army books were in the toilet at that point. Chaos armies were just, you didn't play even for fun back then, because it was no fun playing with Chaos Space Marines back then in 7th Ed 40k. It was just no fun. The Khorne Daemonkin book came along, and it changed a lot. It was clear that it wasn't just an excuse to have the plastic Bloodthirsters in Chaos Space Marine armies. They were experimenting a little bit here. This was the first time we'd ever had a cult or god-specific book in 40k. That is one of the books that's dedicated entirely to a force dedicated to one of the Chaos Powers, to only one of the Chaos Powers, and that happened to be Khorne at this instance. It's a very hard sell. It's a very hard sell for a number of reasons. Khorne is kind of simple as the Chaos Powers go. It's very difficult to make him as ornate or as elaborate or as interesting as Tzeentch, Nurgle or Slaanesh. However, what they did in the Khorne Daemonkin book was they took all of the existing Khorne units from both the Chaos Space Marines and the Khorne Demons and smushed them together. Now, that would have been very easy to do in a half-assed way. It would have been very easy to just do it in a get-you-by army list, just to include the Bloodthirster, to enhance its sales, and that's it. However, this marked the turning point. This was the beginning where they started to pay a lot of attention to Chaos, and they started to make it a lot more than it should have been. The Khorne Daemonkin book is really bloody good. It's really bloody good on a number of levels. First of all, the background and the ethos. The Khorne Daemonkin are not just Khornate Chaos Space Marine warbands. They're something a bit different. They gave them this entire new mythology and ethos whereby they are very specific Khorne cults amongst the Chaos Space Marines, of which there are many, who are trying to emulate the natures, aspects, and the compositions of Khorne's demon hosts in the in the Warp. For the first time ever in a 40k book, we get a lot of detail in how the war hosts of Khorne are organised, how the ethos of Khorne functions within his realm. in the warp, in the Brass Citadel, in the Plains of Blood, how the Bloodletters and the Bloodthirsters and all of the myriad other demons are organised. And they are actually quite organised for demons. They're not like, say, the forces of Slaanesh or Tzeentch, which are a little bit more legitimately chaotic. They are actually organised into cohorts and into ranks and into subdivisions, all organised around multiples of 8, of course. The book has this heavy occult feeling to it, whereby they go into extreme detail about how the Daemonkin facilitate their rituals that bring about the summoning of demons. What they're trying to do is blend the barriers between Khorne's realm and reality so the demons burst through. They are trying to bring themselves closer to that state of what they conceive to be divinity. It's really interesting, and each of the Khorne Daemonkin are not one host either. It's a collective term for a lot of different warbands that operate along slightly similar ethoses and principles. They are a really interesting force, and each of the subdivisions, each of the specific cults have their own ethoses, their own philosophies, their own ways of waging war, and it's really bloody interesting. The book is a great read. It's actually a great read. You get this enormous development in the background on Khorne himself and on the nature of Khorne, on the philosophy of Khorne, how it operates. The warbands of Khorne, how they operate in the 40k universe, are given a real shot in the arm. They feel gothic and archaic and violent and indiscriminate. They are, but also occult. They have this occult quality to them that's really wonderful. The book has a lot of great artwork. It has a lot of feeling. There's a lot of raw feeling in it. And for the first time ever, it introduces a mechanic that makes the basic Chaos Space Marine units viable. So you have this mechanic which has now been translated over to a lot of Khorne books in AOS, which is the Blood Tithe table. The notion that Khorne's followers derive power from taking the heads and souls of their enemies by murder, essentially, by indiscriminate murder. It's essentially a table whereby any time one of your units is wiped out, or you wipe out an enemy unit, because of course Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, you gain a point. And there are 8 points on the table, and you can build them up to the very final point where you can summon a Bloodthirster, or you can spend them on enhancements that spread across the entire army, and these range from giving your units invulnerable saves to giving them extra attacks to stuff like that. It's a really clever way of enhancing units that otherwise were not very good, like Khorne Berserkers, for example, and it lent Khorne armies this extra layer of fascination, whereby you had to think about how you operated. So you had to think about how you were spending your Blood Tithe points. Do I go for the early turn? Do I try and spend all my Blood Tithe points here, or do I split them up? Do I save them up for like the next couple of turns or whatever? It's really bloody clever, and it lends this really characterful flavour to Khorne forces that they didn't have before, and also a tactical element that they didn't have before. And for the first time, they're kind of competitive. They're not great. They're not as amazing as, say, the Eldar were back then, or the Imperial Space Marines, but they are really quite good, and also a great book. It's also notable because it's an indication of what Games Workshop were planning to do with Chaos, both in AOS and in 40k going on. It was very close to the release of 8th Ed, the Khorne Daemonkin book, and it's so clear that they'd already looked at how Chaos was going to manifest, which is not as this polyglot force, but more specifically, so that there were going to be army books for each of the cults and each of the legions and whatnot. That's very, very clear. And this is the test bed, and it went down very well. It went down very, very well, even though it didn't have much in the way of new miniatures releases for it. A very, very good book indeed. Now, moving over to the fantasy side of things, you'd had the end time, so the old world was gone. And all the forces, not just the Chaos forces, were kind of in hiatus. Nobody quite knew what they were going to do with them. When 8th Ed initially hit, I don't think they knew entirely what they wanted to do with them. What they did was released, as they did for 8th Ed 40k with the indices, the index lists, they just released lists for everything. Everything that existed that had a model, they released army lists for. And they were actually pretty fun. They were quite good. And they also released a little bit of new background to introduce them into into the New World. Chaos was interesting because it had to be split into lots of different subdivisions because there's so many forces in the fantasy setting. So all of the old miniatures were translated over. It wasn't really... I mean, these were just get-you-by army lists. They were quite fun. They were quite good, actually, but it was still just get-you-by army lists. It wasn't really until the release of the first book, the first actual army book, that things moved forward, and that book was the Everchosen book. The Everchosen book describes Archaon. It introduces his new miniature where he's on the back of the three-headed Dorgar beast. But it also talks about the history of what the mortal forces of Chaos specifically had been doing under Archaon's rule since the destruction of the old world. You had the introduction of things like the Varangard. You had the notion of the Chaos Space... not the Chaos Space Marines, but the mortal followers of Archaon being these reaving hordes that were spread across all of reality and were like dissolving it at the bedrock. And of Archaon as being this living avatar of chaos, of being a creature who can go toe-to-toe with gods like Nagash and Sigmar and actually come out on top. He's a very powerful figure in the Everchosen book. And it's worth reading. It's really interesting, but very, very old hat now. Very old hat in the sense that we're due a resurrection of that book and of that army very soon, I believe. So it is a little bit... It still suffers from being an early book in AOS, and therefore is not quite stable, is not quite together. It doesn't have the coherence that it might have. It doesn't really have the flavour that it might have yet either, but it's getting there. It is a suggestion of things to come, and of the place of chaos in this new universe, in this new multiverse even, this new order. It isn't until quite a lot later on that you get a proper look at what they want to do with chaos in AOS, and what you get dropping first are some Khorne books, as you had the Daemonkin in 40k. You had I think it was called the Bloodbound, the first book, and again it does essentially with Khorne forces in AOS what the Khorne Daemonkin did in 40k. So it introduces a lot of new units, it incorporates a lot of old ones. The interesting thing that it does is that it establishes the forces of Khorne as something very specific in the AOS setting. They are much more redolent of the classic Chaos forces from the old world, in that they are these all singing, all dancing forces of demons and of barbarians and of tribal peoples. That's the most interesting thing, I think, about the Bloodbound book, is that it enshrines the fact that Khorne's followers are very like the forces, the followers of Chaos from the old world. They are tribal peoples by and large, not always, but by and large. They are tribes that either actively worship Khorne or they are inculcated through conquest, by war or whatever. But what I really love about it is that it does what a lot of the books in AOS do for old forces that have been brought over from Warhammer, from the fantasy battle game. It mythologizes them massively. So you don't just have like mortal followers of Khorne and whatnot. You get blood warriors. Now, blood warriors are the equivalents of Khorne berserkers. They even look like them. But they're not just warriors who follow Khorne. No. They are warriors who have been selected by Khorne because of their ferocity, because of their savagery, and they are mythologized. So their armor is not just armor, it's this mystical stuff that's made out of hardened blood that bursts out of them and solidifies around them when Khorne chooses them. And from that moment on, they become these berserk raging warriors. You have lots of different units now, lots of different gradations of Khorne follower. They're trying to show you the variations that exist amongst Khorne worship. So you have the Bloodbound themselves, who are the tribal peoples, cannibal tribes who follow Khorne. You've got Skull Takers. You've got Skull Takers, who are these demonically imbued big burly warriors who are like giants. They're like Khorne giants of men, elite units who have demon-possessed weapons, and their mythos is that they need to claim a certain number of worthy skulls for Khorne every day. Otherwise, they start to suffer his ire, they start to mutate, they start to go mad. It's absolutely brilliant. You even have these ethoses represented in the characters, because of course the Khorne forces suffer in AOS because AOS is heavily magic based, but there's no magic in Khorne forces. So they introduce the notion of the priests, the slaughter priest, the blood priest, and all of these characters, and they act as conduits between Khorne and the material realm, and they can effect things like blessings. They have effects on the battlefield. They're a little bit like spells, but not quite, which are like Khornate phenomena, which is really cool. It's a very clever way of introducing pseudo-magical elements into a Khorne force, but without breaking the essential Khornateness of it. You no longer need to have your token Chaos Sorcerer, as you did way back when, in your Khorne force to make it viable. It's very clever. But not only that, each of these priests is unique. They each represent a very particular aspect of Khorne, and it's just a way for the designers to demonstrate that Khorne isn't a one-trick pony. There is more here. There are gradations and aspects to Khorne. It's really interesting. It's a very, very good book indeed. But it's a demonstration of where they are taking the Chaos Forces in these new settings, what they are going to do with them. Back over in 40k, we had the transition finally from 7th ed to 8th ed, which was the biggest shift since the transition from 2nd ed to 3rd ed. Before then, really, all of the different editions had run on adaptations of the 3rd edition rule set, right up until 7th ed. 8th ed was huge in that it changed everything. It changed the stats, it shook things up so massively that initially you couldn't carry the codices over. What they had were index lists, which were the Get You By army list, but which gave a certain idea of where they were taking each of the forces. The Chaos Space Marines had a fairly strong one. It was fairly coherent, it worked fairly well. Most of the units in it are pretty good. As the index lists go, not bad at all. But fortunately, along with the Space Marines, the Imperial Space Marines, the Chaos Space Marines were amongst the first to get their Codex for 8th ed, the first Codex, and I tell you what, it's a blinder. It's an absolute blinder. Not perfect, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it's the first time in decades where Chaos is viable. Not only is it viable, it's fun. It's actually fun to use. The forces, although it's actually quite old now, and Chaos is actually due for a revamp very soon, if rumours are to go by, the original 8th ed Chaos Space Marine Codex is a breath of warp-tainted air. It is absolutely wonderful. It's not only a brilliant book in terms of the background, and the background is awesome. It incorporates all the best stuff from previous books, but also establishes where each of the legions and warbands are now in this new setting after the eruption of the Cicatrix Maledictum, after the fall of Cadia. It gives you an idea of where they are and what they're doing. So it actually acts as a sort of cipher for what's going to happen later on, because it's clear now that they're focusing upon individual elements of the Chaos Forces. They're breaking them up so that you're getting individual codices and army releases for the Death Guard, the Thousand Sons, eventually the Emperor's Children and the World Eaters. The Black Legion are due up in Vigilus too. It gives you indications of where they're going. If you read the Iron Warriors intro, for example, it tells you what the Iron Warriors are up to. It tells you what Perturabo is up to now. The Word Bearers, likewise, it tells you what Lorgar is doing. It's really bloody good. On a technical level, it's a really good book. It's not as good as some of those that came later. It doesn't really stand up to the Drukhari Codex, but it's got loads of character and flavour and some lovely tricks you can pull. I mean, some really fun tactical tricks that you can pull with the command point system and the stratagems. It's really quite clever. The God-specific keywords, the marks of chaos that unlock particular abilities from the stratagem list. Very bloody clever, I have to say. It's a really excellent book and has stood the test of time, even though there have been better codices since. It works really well. It still stands up, and more than anything, beyond whatever competitiveness it might have, it's fun. It's fun to make army lists from. It's fun to play. It's great, and I sincerely, ladies and gentlemen, look forward to what's coming next. I sincerely look forward to how they're going to elaborate on what was established in that book. When next we come back, we'll have a look at, in 40k, we'll have a look at the 8th ed Thousand Sons and Death Guard codices, and in AOS, we'll have a look at the Disciples of Zeech and the Khorne Bloodbound, respectively, maybe throwing in the Maggotkin of Nurgle if we've got time. So, until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!